Hello, my name is Scott Lowe. I'm principal with Trauner Consulting Services. This session is going to follow up on a previous session we had that talked about scheduling terminology. We're going to expand on our discussion in this session, focusing on the term float. Let me write that down for you. For those of you who have any experience with scheduling, have done any scheduling over the years, you know float is a very important concept. For those of you that are new to the idea of float, let's do some quick definitions. Float is basically the difference between when a scheduled activity can start and must start so as not to delay the project. And here we're going to talk about project milestones. Obviously, you could schedule a project for intermediate milestones. We're not going to talk about those. So whenever I say float is a measure of the difference between when you can start and must start an activity, I'm going to be talking about a project milestone. But the same discussion in definitions would all apply to intermediate milestones. Essentially, if I delay an activity that has no float, I should delay the project. It's not always the case, particularly with modern scheduling software, but it's conceptually at least, if I delay an activity that has no float, I should delay the project. And similarly, if I delay a project that does have float, I shouldn't experience a project delay. There are lots of ways to think of float. You can think of float as a concept, which is really the way I've defined it so far. In other words, it's conceptually, it's a measure of flexibility of the slop time I have in the schedule, the ability to postpone some work activity and still not have an overall consequence to the project completion date. You can also define float what I would call sort of mathematically. And if you're working with a CPM schedule, mathematically, float is the difference between the early and late dates. In other words, when I run a schedule calculation on a critical path method or CPM schedule, I typically will calculate early start and finish dates for a particular activity, and from the backward pass, I will calculate the late start and finish dates. Now, mathematically, the difference between those early start and late start dates or early finish and late finish dates is float. And when you pick up a scheduled tabular report and you look at that, that's what you'll see. You'll be able to literally calculate float in the schedule from that. I make a distinction between mathematically calculated float and conceptual float because there are lots of ways in modern scheduling software to affect the float number that really don't necessarily have a big effect or change necessarily the conceptual definition. In other words, by constraining the completion date of the project to a date earlier than the schedule really will predict the project will finish, you'll end up with negative float. In other words, the project can't finish by the date that you've constrained the completion date to. Negative float is a pretty hard concept to get your arms around if you really think about it. It basically says that I have to finish the project before I can start it, or something along those lines. But what it's really trying to tell you is you simply just can't complete the project by the date you've constrained the completion of the calculations at. So we're not going to talk about negative float here other than to say that it's more of a result of the way I calculate a schedule than it is necessarily affecting my overall concept of what float means. An activity with negative float could still have float relative to activities that have more negative float. And if that's not confusing enough, we can throw some other stuff in there, which I'm not going to do. The question might become, really, is float a useful number? And I think if you think about it as a difference between when I can start and must start, it clearly is something useful. For example, as an owner, I might be able to use float in order to make a revision to the project, and that revision might fall on a path of work that has float, and as a consequence, even though I change the design, I don't necessarily have to change the project completion date. Similarly, if I was a contractor and I had a subcontractor who went out of business or refused to perform the work that I had subcontracted to them, and I had to find another subcontractor, if there was float on that work, I might have time to go out and get another sub and still not affect my scheduled completion date for the project. So float can be of great value. It can also be of value to a contractor if, for example, an example I use in this case would be pile driving. Theoretically, if you have 10 piers worth of piles to drive, you could mobilize 10 pile driving rigs and drive all 10 piers at the same time. But you could also mobilize one pile driving rig and drive each pile successively. Well, if you had no float on pile driving, and in order to complete the project on time, you had to mobilize 10 pile driving rigs, then that's what you'd have to do. But if you had float on pile driving such that you only had to mobilize one, and you could complete all the pile driving work within that period, you actually could complete the project in quite a bit less time. In quite a bit less cost in the same time. The result being that we can use float to level our crew and equipment requirements, and ultimately, as a result, complete the work at lower cost, at least typically. So, float is an important concept in scheduling, and it is an important thing when we're talking about economical and efficient management of a project. And it's certainly something that you want to have associated with the work you're performing. Now, given its value, a good question might be, who owns it? Who owns float? Well, the answer to that question depends very much on what your contract says. So, for example, if I had a contract that was silent as to who owns float, then the question would become, what's the, for lack of a better expression, industry standard or normal legal practice, or legal precedent as it relates to that subject? Typically, float is considered to be owned by the contract, not contractor, not owner, but the contract, meaning it belongs to the project, and it's available to all parties to the contract on an as-needed basis. In other words, if I was a contractor and my pile driving work had float, then I could use that float to mobilize fewer pile driving rigs so that I could level my equipment requirements and perhaps have lower equipment costs for pile driving. Now, what happens when the float runs out? In other words, again, using our pile driving example, if I, as a contractor, mobilized fewer rigs than would be necessary to complete all the work at once, but instead sort of strung it out using fewer rigs, eventually I might consume all the float associated with the pile driving activities, and at that point I could not go with fewer rigs. In other words, I'd have to stay within the boundary of the overall period of time required to do the work plus whatever float was available. So the bottom line there is that I could use the float until it's all used up, and then there's no more to use. Who gets it first? Typically, the answer to that question is first come, first serve. I think if it's something that's going to be something of a bone of contention, I think it makes sense for the parties to communicate and talk about how much float really exists for an activity, particularly if that float is going to be used to level a contractor's resources. So if that conversation comes up on the project, I think it's helpful. Oftentimes it doesn't, and typically in those circumstances, it's more or less a first come, first served basis that float is available to the project participants. That's if the contract is silent. Now, many contracts now, and frankly, your contract, should say exactly who owns the float. The simplest contract provision simply restates the norm or the industry standard, which is that the contract owns a float and all parties to the contract have float available to them on a more or less first come, first served basis or as needed basis until it expires. So that would be the normal contract provision, and if I was reviewing a contract for a client, I would be looking to make sure that provision is there, because that's probably the fairest distribution of float, at least looking at defining fairness outside of the contract. Now, there are some contracts that are not written that way. Certainly some contracts say, for example, that the contractor owns a float. A common provision, for example, would be a subcontractor provision. In other words, a provision between a general contractor and a subcontractor, where the schedule says that the subcontractor has to start and finish all their work by the early start and finish dates in the schedule. That essentially means that the subcontractor cannot use the float associated with those activities in performing their work. They must start them on early dates and finish by the early dates, meaning that there is no float available to that work and that they don't own the float, meaning that they don't own a portion of the float. It's not available to them on a first-come, first-served basis. That's a very common subcontractor provision. Subcontractors who are bidding work should be aware of that provision. And if it's something they should negotiate, that would be a provision they need to have eliminated, or at least they need to have the conversation with the general contractor to find out really where the float is for their work or is not. Another kind of provision, kind of on the opposite side of things, would be a provision that where the owner says they own the float, and there certainly are provisions out there like that. Essentially what those provisions say are the same sorts of things that those provisions would say to a subcontractor, which is that the general contractor in this case, when the owner owns a float, has to start and finish their work all by the early dates. There is no float. They all have to start and finish on their earliest dates. So those provisions are out there. If I was a general contractor, I'd certainly want to be aware of that. I'd want to be aware of the fact that the owner believes that they own the float. And I want to be aware of the fact that, at least from the project management perspective, it's the owner's position that the contractor has no float on their work and must perform them essentially by the early dates. So those are sort of the four most common situations. The contract is silent, which is probably most common, although I don't have any statistics to establish that. Where float is defined as a commodity available to the project to be shared by project participants. That's probably the second most common provision in a contract related to float. In other words, versus silence. And then the other two provisions are relatively rare, although I think it's fairly common in a subcontract for float to be, for the subcontractor to have an obligation to start work on the early dates and finish on the early dates. So I think it's relatively common in subcontractor contracts for float to belong to the general contractor. Now, you can get more complex than that. Let's imagine a circumstance where one of the parties to the contract completes their work quicker than planned. For example, let's say the owner turned around their submittal that they were reviewing and approving for the contractor more quickly than the contractor had allowed in his schedule. Let's say the schedule allowed 14 calendar days and the owner was able to turn it around in 6 calendar days or 7 calendar days. So there was a week early. Well, if that work had float in the first place, if I complete it a week early, it has 7 more days of float. In other words, by completing non-critical work early, I essentially give more float to the path that activity falls on, assuming everything else proceeds as planned. Well, who owns that new float, that found float, that created float? Well, if you have a contract that's silent, it belongs to both parties on a first come, first served basis. If you have a contract that says it's owned by the contract and available to both parties on a first come, first served basis, then that's exactly the circumstance. Essentially, the float's available to both parties. However, there are contract provisions out there that specifically say that if one party creates float, that float belongs to them. So if float is created on a path by a party's actions, or inactions, I guess, probably more likely actions, that float belongs to that party for the remainder of the project. So you end up having to set up a little bit of an accounting system during the course of the project. As a party completes work more expeditiously than anticipated, time goes in their column to create float. If they take longer to perform the work than anticipated, then time comes out of that accounting system and is accounted against any savings they may have already accumulated. So you can see there's a little bit more complexity associated with managing a project that deals with float in that manner. So again, the bottom line here is focus clearly on your contract. Read your contract to see what it says about float, and recognize that statements like "you must start and finish your work by the early dates" have the effect of taking away any float you may have had associated with your work. Let's take some float concepts and go a little bit farther. What happens when a critical activity is delayed? Well, as we've defined in previous sessions, the critical path is the longest path of work through the project, and we're talking about project completion dates here, not interim milestones. The critical path to project completion date is the path of work that determines when the project will be finished. So if I delay that project, I'm essentially pushing out the project completion date. Now, if there's a path of work that's making expected progress that's parallel with the critical path, if I push out the completion date of the project, essentially I'm saying I now am going to take more time to build a project, and that may mean that I've in effect given float to non-critical work. Now, the amount of float that's generated for non-critical work when critical work is delayed it fluctuate based on the progress of those non-critical activities and whether or not revisions are made to the schedule and a number of other considerations. But the bottom line is, delaying the critical path of work can have the effect of giving float to other paths of work. Similarly, if I were to accelerate a project, in other words, bring in the scheduled completion date, I might have the opposite effect. In other words, as I bring in the project completion date, I have the effect of taking float away from other paths. In fact, the situation could occur that as I take time away from the project, essentially I take so much float away from other paths of work that they themselves become critical, meaning they have no float. And if I don't also accelerate those activities, the result is, at that point, I probably can't accelerate the project further. In other words, in order to make further accelerations, further savings in time, I have to accelerate not only the original critical path, but all the work that's now on our new collapsed critical path. So float has a lot of relationship to the dynamic conditions that are occurring on the project. Delay is perhaps giving float to other paths of work that aren't critical, and acceleration is perhaps taking time away or taking float away from those very same paths. Float is also relevant when we start talking about the subject of delay. Because as I said before, the only way to delay a project is along a critical path. So essentially, when we're talking about delay to a project completion date or intermediate milestone, but we're going to focus on project completion dates, I'm essentially saying that there's no float available to that activity, and its delay is pushing out the project completion date. But I'm also saying the activity really doesn't have any float. So when we're evaluating whether or not an activity has been delayed, a delay to an activity is delaying the project, we have to evaluate whether or not the float associated with that activity has been consumed. It's no longer available. In other words, it's been used by one of the parties on the project until there is no more float, and any further delay is going to delay the project. Essentially, the critical path shifts to the work where the float has been consumed. And a lot of schedule analysis and delay analysis is based on an understanding of what has happened to the float on the project. Has it been eaten up by a delay to a particular non-critical activity such that that non-critical activity actually consumes the float available to it and takes over the critical path? What point does that occur? When does the critical path shift from this path that was previously not critical to a path that is now critical? Those are very important aspects of schedule and delay analysis, which we'll cover in another session, but they relate specifically to how we deal with the consumption of float and how we keep track of it. So to sort of summarize our discussion, float is the difference between when an activity can start and must start so as not to delay the project. Float is an important scheduling concept and certainly a valuable commodity on a project, useful to the owner. If they have to make a change and it occurs on a path with float, then they don't have to extend the project completion date. And similarly, if a contractor has a problem that consumes float, say a subcontractor doesn't show up, if there is float on that subcontractor's work, then they will be able to complete the project by the scheduled completion date. And if the scheduled completion date and the contract date are the same time, they'll be able to complete the contract on time. Float provisions in your contract are extremely important, so review your contract closely. The most likely occurrence is probably that your contract is silent about float. If that's the case, then you typically can conservatively presume that that means that float is a commodity available to all parties to the contract on a first-come, first-served basis. If your contract does address float, that's usually how it will be addressed. If not, it will typically say which party owns the float, with the situation probably most common in a subcontractor's contract that the subcontractor has to start and finish their work by early and late dates, which means there really is very little float. When you're looking at float from a perspective of what's happening as the project is progressing, if a critical path of work is delayed, then most likely float is being is being added to the non-critical work. And if you're accelerating the project, it's likely that float is being consumed and less float is available to all the work on the project. When we're analyzing delay, we're looking to see when the float on a non-critical path is consumed by the delay, and that delay becomes critical and begins delaying the project or intermediate milestone.